It's a growing epidemic, ruining lives and families. Heroin. And our communities are not immune. ABC 15 News is digging deeper to find out just how strong a hold heroin has on our community. It's your voice, your future, defining and defeating the heroin epidemic.
We are going to talk about the heroin epidemic and the opioid epidemic for the next hour. We have a panel of experts here who could really address what the situation is here in our area. Let's introduce this panel. We have Major Mike Nunn from the Florence County Sheriff's Office. We have State Representative Alan Clemens, who represents Myrtle Beach. We have Solicitor Jimmy Richardson. He's the solicitor basically for Horry County and Georgetown County, prosecuting a lot of these crimes. And we have Dr. Paul Richardson from Conway Medical Center. And yes, you two are related. You're cousins.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. I want to start off. This struck me. Heroin use has more than doubled in the past decade among young adults aged 18 to 25 years old. So we're seeing this hit our young people, but we also see it hit just about every walk of life. I want to start off with law enforcement. Major, how big of a problem is this in our area?
Well, it's a huge problem, and what we're seeing is a whole new demographic of our population involved in this opioid drug use. Used to be, generations ago, it was rock stars, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, famous folks that were involved in heroin, and the regular drug use for the general population was something else. Unfortunately now, what we're seeing is the whole new demographic of individuals who've never been involved in the drug culture, never had problems with being involved in drug trafficking. They're finding themselves in this new world, and unfortunately, it's deadly. It results in overdose, death, and destruction of families. So it's a huge problem.
We know police recently, just in the last week, arrested somebody who police say is tied to several overdoses in our area. Solicitor Richardson, I know you have been with the solicitor's office for a long time. Have you seen an uptick in recent years in crimes dealing with heroin?
Tim, first of all, when I started, there was no heroin in Horry County. It was crack and it was cocaine. You'd see a little bit of heroin in Charleston, but there was none around here. Now we have very little cocaine and crack. It's all heroin. So it has gone up tremendously, and not only is it the drug itself, but if you could draw a circle around any of these drug houses, you would see the property crimes just escalate all over themselves. Golf carts getting stolen, grills getting stolen, anything that's not nailed down is stolen. So I would say every facet of the criminal justice system has been impacted. Violent crimes a little bit lesser, but there's still a lot of, the gangs are fed by heroin, and of course there's violent crime, but the property crime skyrocketing is because of heroin. And the deal is, Dr. Richardson could talk a lot more on this, but when it was crack and when it was cocaine, a person could binge and you might not see them, as a drug seller may not see them for 3-4 days. They could go without crack for a good long time. Heroin or opioids, if you are addicted to those, they're going to be every day. They're an everyday person coming in and buying them. So it's not a social drug at all. It is something that you must maintain daily once you start it.
And this isn't just something law enforcement's dealing with, it is something that the medical community has to deal with. Dr. Richardson, tell me about how treating heroin addiction is evolving and how much of it is it tying up our medical resources?
Well, it is. It is. What we're seeing is we're seeing a lot more overdoses come in. We're seeing a lot more folks who are overdosing on these drugs. I'm assuming that's probably from just the difference in potency it's going on. Even at Conway Medical Center, we've seen over the last 6 months about a 70% increase from the 6 months prior.
70%?
70. Wow. That's correct. And we used to never see double-digit numbers of overdose cases coming in, but we actually are seeing that in the last 6 months. So I do believe, yes, it's tying up a huge amount of resources, and I think it will become a bigger problem if we don't start to turn the tide on this thing.
Okay. ABC 15's Allison Floyd has been monitoring social media. She has some questions, concerns that viewers have sent in to us. Allison, what do you have for us?
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, as part of this town hall, many of you sent in questions for the panel and wanted to know about this heroin epidemic. Our first question tonight comes from Jenny Angle, who says that there needs to be a place where people can be rehabilitated for several months. She said too many people are overdosing and dying, and her question is, I would like to know why the state or Horry County doesn't provide a place to house the people who want to get off drugs. If we could send that over to Alan Clemens, maybe.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And the question's really, the answer to the question goes beyond opioid abuse, and it goes towards alcohol abuse and all types of abuse. It is true, there are a limited number of beds in South Carolina where such treatment can be received. And oftentimes, if you go to Conway Hospital or Grand Strand Hospital, you'll see rooms that have been dedicated to those that are in need of treatment, but there are insufficient beds to afford that treatment around the state, and they're in the hospital just as a parking place until such a bed becomes available. It's an issue that the General Assembly has been addressing by increasing funds to the Department of Mental Health and other agencies to allow for new beds. However, we can't keep up. There is a never-ending supply, it seems, of those that are in need of treatment. So I think that we just need to keep trying to do as much as we can for those that are in need.
All right. I'll tell you what, we're going to take a quick break, but as we go to break, I want to let everybody know you can visit WPDE.com. Look for our Hooked on Heroin section, where we will have all this information that you may need to know if you or someone you know is suffering from some type of opioid addiction. We'll be right back to continue our Defeating the Heroin Epidemic Town Hall. Welcome back to the Your Voice, Your Future Defeating the Heroin Epidemic Town Hall. We have a panel of experts here talking about just how pervasive opioid abuse is in our area. I shared this statistic with you all before we started taping. It really, really surprised me. And this is according to the American Society of Addiction Medicine, that in 2012, 259 million prescriptions were written for opioids, and that's more than enough to give every American adult their own bottle of pills. Here's one more for you. 4 in 5 new heroin users started out misusing prescription painkillers. So let's start off with the medical community on this one. Is overprescription a problem? Is there anything being done within the medical community, maybe to taper the prescribing of things like OxyContin?
I think there definitely is an awareness more of prescription drug abuse than there used to be. There are various things that are coming into play now in the medical community. One is where some of the third-party payers are actually requiring the prescriber to search a database that the state has put up, where it logs all of a patient's prescription drugs, all of their controlled substances, and requires a review. So at least the prescriber is aware of do they have multiple prescribers? Have they been getting over a certain number of pills and that kind of thing? So I do think there's a lot of measures that are getting put in place to try to turn the tide of battle, so to speak. But there's still a lot more to do.
From a law enforcement standpoint, which is tougher to control? Opioids on the street like OxyContin, or the heroin. And really quickly, actually, before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about why OxyContin and heroin are such, I guess, so closely related. It's really not that much of a different effect that the two drugs have on you.
That's correct. I mean, they're essentially cousins, and they're stimulating the same receptors in our body, and so you're getting a lot of the same effects. One of the issues is, though, that the OxyContin, oxycodone, that's fairly expensive, and the heroin, I understand, is relatively cheap. And so I think that's where you see a lot of the migration, at least in the patient population.
So is that what you're seeing on the streets? It's cheaper to go out and get heroin made by who knows who, laced with who knows what.
Right.
Yeah.
Dr. Richardson is exactly right. What we're seeing is not everyone, but a sizable portion of those who are addicted to opioids and wind up on heroin start with prescription medication. And for one reason or another, physician prescribes the medication, perhaps legitimately so, to control pain. The individual gets addicted to it, and when the prescription runs out, or the physician won't prescribe it anymore, there's only one thing that will scratch that neurological itch, and unfortunately, that's street heroin. As far as the question of why is it so cheap now, the actual prescription medication is pretty expensive if you have to buy it, as opposed to heroin on the street, which is cheap. Why is that? Well, the Mexican cartels have figured out that they can grow poppies in Mexico. It used to be that opium heroin came into the country through Asia, major port cities, airplanes, ships, these type of things. Now it comes up from our southern border. The Mexican cartels have flooded the market, and it's relatively cheap by comparison, and certainly available in plenty on the street. The problem with that is, unlike the prescription medication, which is controlled in its manufacture and its milligrams per dosage, you never know what you're getting when you buy the heroin off the street. Maybe it's cut with something that's not toxic, maybe it is. What we're also seeing is that a lot of times the heroin that we seize is laced with other things like fentanyl and other things that are toxic and will kill as well. So it's the problem is compounding itself more and more.
Let's go back to ABC 15's Allison Floyd. She's been monitoring social media and has a question for you.
Jane Ward Jernigan wanted to know, she also brought up the issue of fentanyl that Major Nunn just talked about, and wants to know that since you and your team have seen fentanyl and that it can kill, please explain how that works to us. She also asked, how can first responders be protected when they're responding to these addicts? Major Nunn?
That's a huge problem, and we are trying to work with our deputies and our narcotics agents to be aware of the danger of fentanyl. I'm told by our chemist that 5 micrograms inhaled can be toxic. And so there have actually been instances where a search warrant might be issued, and in powder form, the suspect will actually throw the fentanyl powder at the agents in an attempt to get them, under the influence. And Dr. Richardson could speak to the effects of fentanyl on the human body that way, but from what we're being told, it can be extremely dangerous to be exposed.
What is fentanyl? We report this in news stories a lot, that law enforcement is taking fentanyl-laced heroin off the street. What is this?
Fentanyl is another opioid, very, very potent opioid. And like the Major was saying, it's extremely dangerous, extremely dangerous. The problem is small doses can be toxic. That's why that is a drug that really needs medical supervision. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of these overdose cases are probably laced with the fentanyl, where they can't control that dosage. And you basically get the same effect, the respiratory depression, these other symptoms that we see, but without any control whatsoever.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about legislation that you introduced and have passed in the State House to try to stem the heroin trafficking along the Grand Strand into Palmetto State. We'll be right back. Don't forget, you can go to WPDE.com, look for our Hooked on Heroin section, where you can find a lot of useful information. We will be right back. Welcome back to the Your Voice, Your Future Defeating the Heroin Epidemic Town Hall. We have a panel of experts talking about opioids and heroin addiction. It surprised me, and it probably surprised a lot of people to know that until very recently, money laundering was pretty easy to do in the state of South Carolina. But Representative Clemens, you've tried to put a cork in that bottle.
Well, we have. I hope the cork fits well and staunches the free trade of money from South Carolina. We, after having been educated by Solicitor Richardson and his predecessor, Greg Hembry, and others in law enforcement, we discovered that South Carolina was the only state in the country that allowed the free exchange of money from illegal gotten gains to other countries.
How did that work?
It's called the money transfers business. And there are some legitimate companies in the money transfers business, like American Express or Western Union. Unfortunately, cartels had come into South Carolina. Every major heroin cartel has a presence in South Carolina, or have had a presence in South Carolina. And the reason for being here was for the transfer of funds internationally under $3,000, we had no regulation whatsoever. The only state in the country that had no regulation on such transfers of funds internationally. Legislation that we passed in the last year, legislation that we'd been working on for 6 years, was passed in both the House and the Senate and signed by the governor this year. So we're looking forward to, well, the welcome mat in South Carolina has been pulled out.
So I guess the way they were operating, they'd take these under $3,000 transfers and make them. So if they had $60,000 to move, they'd just make several transfers until it was all moved where they wanted it to go.
Absolutely.
How does this new law, what does it give you? Is this a game changer, Solicitor Richardson?
I think, no, I wouldn't say it's a silver bullet. But here's what it has done. Anytime you are the lowest, water is going to find its level. And unfortunately, with the Mexican cartel, it found its level in South Carolina for many years, whereas all of the other states have pretty much shut it down. So I think we ended up getting a lot of these drugs into our area and became a hub for them because we did not control money laundering to that extent. And a lot of people set up. I think it is just the fact of having a law now means that South Carolina is not singled out, 1 against 49. So it is going to be beneficial. We haven't seen the full benefits of that as of yet. It just passed last year. But it did regulate those. And Tim, a big myth that was out there, even when we were young, is that you thought all of these migrant workers would keep a very small portion of their check and then send the rest back to Mexico. But what we found, and Alan was there for all of this, actually, Andy Lewis did a great job of putting this together. But what you find is that all of that money from all over Horry County and coming in from Florence and Marion and everywhere else was going to one of 3 houses in Mexico. So it's not going to different people's homes. It was going to one of 3 houses. I think that was 97% of it went to those 3 houses. And that there was 3% that funneled in through other Central American states. But most of it was going to those 3. It tells us it's drugs. Also, what you were seeing at the same time, Andy, the guy that put this stuff together, we had gotten him to trace money. He had came from the United States Army, where that's what he did in Afghanistan. He was finding this money going from Horry County to Mexico and then into Hezbollah or Hamas, all kind of international terrorist groups, which was absolutely shocking that anybody in the Middle East would have even heard of Horry County. But we have closed that loop thanks to Representative Clemens, and now we are right along with the other 50 states. We should see a big benefit from that.
All right. We're going to take another quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about legislation that might be on the radar coming down the pike that might be able to help out law enforcement. And I also want to get into talking about the abuser and how we need to look at them as a victim or a criminal. We're going to take a break. We'll come back right back with Defeating the Heroin Epidemic Town Hall. Don't forget, go to WPDE.com. Look for the Hooked on Heroin section on our website, where you can find a lot of information that we're talking about here tonight. Welcome back to our Your Voice, Your Future Defeating the Heroin Epidemic Town Hall. We've got a great panel here talking about the opioid and heroin epidemic. Let's go to ABC 15's Allison Floyd right now, who has a question from a viewer from social media. Allison?
We've gotten a lot of questions in, Tim, from the ABC 15 Facebook page. This question comes from Fred Pledger, who is talking about drug dealers and how they could be held responsible for drug-related injuries and deaths. And so we're going to direct this question to Solicitor Richardson. And we've done stories with you in the past about heroin and the trafficking of that drug. You've talked about that drug enforcement unit. You have a team who works to take down these criminals. So Fred Pledger's comments bring up a question about what is being done to stop drug dealers and what kind of sentences can they face?
Great question, Fred. The DEU unit that Allison mentioned has taken $49 million worth of street-level drugs off of the streets. It's been really good. Now there's a lot of them out there, so it's easier to do than if you were in Edgefield or somewhere else. But 49 million's a lot. Those guys, the law is already there to be able to punish the drug dealer. We've got some very strict laws, and they are graduated for second offense and third offense. Matter of fact, it is true, you can do more time for distribution or trafficking in heroin, third offense, than you could for murder. It's 30 years. That's an awful long time. And in our office, we've got two designated prosecutors that are now special U.S. attorneys. And I know in Florence they've done the same thing. So we are helping the federal government out by, see, they've got maybe 1, 2 federal prosecutors in Florence. But what we have done is gone through their system so that now there's a couple of our guys that can go to Florence and prosecute them as the federal system. So the laws are already there for the traffickers of heroin or cocaine or any of that stuff. That isn't a problem. And there's mandatory minimums. So even if a judge were wanting to give somebody a break, there's a bottom to that. It's like from 25 to 30 years. There's not a lot of wiggle room for judges. We've got the laws there and we're getting great sentences. But when water is pouring over the boat like it has been, you know, you take that one guy out, there's going to always be someone there. We have really got to focus on drying up the opiates that's getting a lot more people addicted. That's you can't arrest your way out of this thing.
And let's ask Major Nunn about this, because dawned on me, you have I-95 running right through your county and all the PD counties up there. What are you seeing come off I-95? We know in the past it was used to move drugs from Miami up to New York City. Is it still a major drug pipeline, and is a lot of heroin moving along I-95? Yes,
I-95 and I-20 have been designated by the federal government as high density drug trafficking areas. We have specially trained criminal enforcement units that monitor the interstate and are quite successful in detecting the trafficking of drugs up and down the interstate. So we're very proud of that, but we obviously can't get it all. And a lot of the drugs move on the interstates.
And Representative Clements, you've got the money laundering bill through. What else do you think could be done to help Major Nunn, Solicitor Richardson in prosecuting these offenses?
Well, there are several things, and really during the break we had an opportunity to talk about a couple of those areas. One of them is we are constantly tweaking. It seems like every session there are new formulations of drugs that in an attempt to bypass the formularies within statute so that the most recent iteration of drugs aren't illegal per se. So we're talking about a way to bypass the legislative change of those formularies, giving SLED or DHEC the ability on an emergency basis to determine what drugs need to be listed on our
It seems to me as an outsider looking in at the epidemic, it takes a long time to get a law through. I mean,
does.
at least 6 months. And these dealers, these I guess cartels, are coming up with ways to circumvent whatever you can pass out of Columbia
Absolutely.
just as quickly as you can pass them, if not quicker.
Absolutely.
Tim, a great example of that in the past has been the bath salts. Previously, they were not listed on a schedule of illegal drugs. Well, in the meantime, people are taking them, they're overdosing, they're having violent reactions, and it's hurting and killing people. Well, if we have to wait until the legislature next comes in session and then have bills introduced and go through the usual process, and we understand that process takes time, it's designed that way, that's the way it's supposed to work. You know, if there's some mechanism by which we could quickly classify those things as illegal, we could have a better shot.
Yeah, one molecule in some instances changes something from legal to illegal.
That's right.
We have to take another break. When we come back, I do want to talk about the treatment of addicts and how we should look at the victims. Should we look at them as victims, addicts, patients? We'll talk about that with Dr. Paul Richardson when we come back. Don't forget, WPDE.com, our Hooked on Heroin section, has a lot of this information we're talking about. We'll be right back.
It's a growing epidemic, ruining lives and families. Heroin. And our communities are not immune. ABC 15 News is digging deeper to find out just how strong a hold heroin has on our community. It's your voice, your future, defining and defeating the heroin epidemic.
Welcome back to our Your Voice, Your Future town hall on the epidemic of heroin in our communities. We have a great panel here today. Major Mike Nunn with the Florence County Sheriff's Office, State Representative Alan Clements, who represents most of Myrtle Beach. We have Solicitor Jimmy Richardson, who's basically the prosecutor for Horry and Georgetown counties. And we have Dr. Paul Richardson, who's a physician at Conway Medical Center. We talk about the stats. I mean, they really are incredible. The one I pointed out earlier, about 259 million prescriptions written for opioids in 1 year, and 4 in every 5 heroin users start out misusing prescription painkillers. These cartels, these dealers, wouldn't have any business if there wasn't a market out there for it. And it seems like you have to take a multi-pronged approach to stop this, and we've been talking about some of those ways over the past half hour or so. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? And it looks like in this case the opioids came first, turning people to heroin. I think you mentioned earlier we used to think it was the rock star drug, but now it's the soccer mom drug, it's the professional, businessman's drug, it's the college kid's drug. What type of people are you seeing come through the system, Solicitor Richardson?
All types. It really is. It's everybody that's coming through at this point. I mean, my kid on it, but used to, when dealers would go down to Mexico to buy cocaine, the cartels were pretty smart. They had figured out that we were being overprescribed, and those guys started saying, if you want to buy this amount of cocaine, you have to buy this amount of heroin. And it was a market that was already set and ripe for it. So that started maybe about 8 years ago, and it didn't take us but about a lag time of 2 to start seeing it. But you are seeing generally more than ever people that have legitimate pain issues that started off on prescription drugs, and it may have been necessary for a while, but then of course having to move over to heroin because they couldn't pay $1 a milligram for the drug on the black market. You know, 180 milligram pill is now $180, and you can't keep that habit up. So they've all turned to heroin, but you see whites, blacks, male, female. Usually you don't see as many old people on heroin, but anybody, we see it almost in every middle school. Not heroin, but we see the prescription drugs.
And I think that brings up the point that you know, at middle school's mother, grandmother, grandfather, father might have had treatment for, say, cancer, or had some kind of broken limb and was prescribed an opioid. Father or mother says, I'm too strong, I'm not going to use the opioid, puts it in the medicine cabinet. Kids could come in, take it out of the medicine cabinet. Is that, I assume that's happening.
It happened in my house. I had a tooth pulled, and the doctor gave me, I don't know if it was hydrocodone or Oxycontin, but it was something to get you through the, but I took one and left the rest of them up in the medicine cabinet. And we started doing a program, a video, to send out to school-age children. And I went back and looked, and the project is to clean out your medicine cabinet. Well, doggone if they weren't still there. And I don't know if I thought, well, now to all addicts or thieves, they're gone now. So no reason to break into my house. I don't have any narcotics here. But I did go back, and I don't know if I just said, well, maybe I'll break a bone or a toe or something and need this. The trick is you can get them for the cost of a copay. So get rid of all of those prescription drugs. You hit on it. 80% of people that get addicted get them from grandma and grandpa's or mom and daddy's medicine cabinet, and start on this road that's going to lead to heroin every time.
A dark road. Let's toss things over right now to ABC 15's Allison Floyd, who's been monitoring social media. She has a question for us.
I do, Tim. Thank you so much. Terry Jean reached out to us on Facebook and wanted to talk about mental health services, rehab, and treatment for addicts. And we received a lot of questions about how to help addicts. So, Major Nunn, what resources do addicts have in the PD?
Well, of course, we specialize on the enforcement side as opposed to the treatment side. However, there are facilities available in the Florence area, Circle Park. There are methadone clinics. There are other agencies. They're doing the best they can. They're all swamped right now. And the problem that we're seeing with the heroin is it's going to take professional help almost to break this. You're going to need specialized care and assistance in breaking this habit. And you know, our resources are stretched pretty thin, but those are available. The methadone clinic, methadone is no panacea. It's not without its problems either, and we're seeing abuse of the methadone from time to time. But at least it's a step in the right direction. So we obviously support all of those methods and modalities, and we encourage anyone who believes that they can kick this habit by themselves, think again, reach out, try to find some help.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk with Dr. Paul Richardson a little bit more about the treatment and what's available, and maybe Representative Alan Clemens about if the state is able to do anything to help people out who may have an addict in their family. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll have more of our Your Voice, Your Future, Defeating the Heroin Epidemic Town Hall. Welcome back to our Your Voice, Your Future town hall on the heroin epidemic and how to defeat it. We have a great panel here. I want to talk a little bit about the victims, the people who are using this. Are they victims? Are they criminals? How should they be treated? Let's start off actually with Solicitor Jimmy Richardson. What do you know, these people, you want to say they're caught in the middle, but they are breaking laws. How it seems like a very fine line that prosecution and law enforcement have to walk.
Law enforcement is on board, legislation, all of them are on. This is a great program that we've got, and they've got in Florence. But drug court is great. And they are both victims and they're both defendants. Mm-hmm. One is not exclusive of the other. If you're selling, if you're trafficking, you are a defendant. Mm-hmm. You know, there's not a lot there for you. But if you're a user, we understand that. And drug court has been very successful because they have to test 3 times a week. They've got to have a job. Paul said earlier off the air that it was a social issue as well as a physical addiction. It's a social addiction. But when you have to test all of the time, it helps give them a backbone too. Now, I can't use cocaine or heroin because I've got to be tested. Mm-hmm. And then we give them sobriety. Anything that we come up with, it's got to consider this. Because you were asking Alan, 72 hours ain't enough time. It's like a 72-hour diet. There's no reason to even go on it. Mm-hmm. If you can't it's going to take about a year. And then it's going to take a lifetime because the people that I talk to, they're still addicts. But that's, we understand that there are addicts out there that are not necessarily bad people, but they are criminals. Mm-hmm. So there's that mid-level drug court, and it's very successful.
And we've seen that drug court in action. I believe we've done some stories on ABC 15 in Conway and talked to some of the people who have been through it. Now, addiction is tough, and it affects just about every one of us, either directly or indirectly. There's an addict in my family, not opioid, but an addict nonetheless, who had a very difficult time kicking mm-hmm. their substance. And that's my question to you, Dr. Richardson, is how is the medical community treating addicts? Is it evolving now that we're seeing so many more people addicted to opioids? Is there any new great news on the horizon of treating addiction?
I think it is evolving. Tim, I think it is evolving. The bad news is there's really not a whole lot of new breakthroughs. We're doing what we have been doing. There are transitions to methadone that we talked about earlier, trying to get the heroin addict to the methadone, which should be more controllable. But just like I think Representative Clemens said, it has its own issues. Has its own issues. So even though we do have, that's our approach, counseling, mental health. But we've already talked about earlier on the program about the scarcity of resources in the mental health community as well. Because really, like I said earlier, it is a physical and a psychological addiction, and very difficult to kick. And that's one thing I try to stress when I'm counseling patients or anyone about. Sometimes it only takes one time. I mean, if you look at statistics, over a quarter of these folks who try heroin are going to become addicted and be an addict, potentially for life. Really for life. So I think to me that speaks volumes into just how dangerous this is and what a slippery slope it is. This is not something that folks can just sort of try on a whim and no harm, no foul. It's definitely harm.
We've had some great viewer questions come into us through social media. ABC 15's Allison Floyd's been monitoring those. What do you have for us, Allison?
Well, Nancy Weber reached out to us, Tim, and wanted to talk about how doctors and police fit into trying to find a solution to the heroin epidemic. Her comments bring up a question: what can be done to combat abuse of prescription pain medication and avoid the potential for addiction? And if we could go to Major Mike Nunn to talk about the drug take-back program, that is one way that police are getting involved.
Several years ago, Sheriff Boone had us implement a drug take-back program, which basically sponsored through Drug Enforcement Administration, that allows for prescription medications to be turned in without any prosecution, no questions asked. It's an amnesty program. The design is to get the drugs out of the potential distribution stream, whether it be in someone's medicine cabinet. as Jimmy was talking earlier about the medication that he had stored at one time, we're encouraging folks to bring those to us and deposit them in a drug take-back box, and there are no questions asked. It used to be that you would flush old prescription medications down the toilet. That's no longer an environmentally sound practice. Some will burn them. Regardless, we will take those and we will destroy them in an environmentally appropriate way if you'll bring them to us. And no one's being prosecuted if they bring these in. It gets them off the street, it keeps children from being poisoned, and it's all around a great program. We'd encourage anyone who has those substances, don't keep them, turn them in. We'll destroy them for you.
All right. Well, we're going to take one more break. We'll be back with more of this Your Voice, Your Future town hall on the epidemic of heroin abuse. Don't forget, go to WPDE.com where you can find a lot of resources in our Hooked on Heroin section. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our Your Voice, Your Future on defeating the heroin epidemic. We have a great panel here today, and we have about 5 or 6 minutes to wrap things up today. A lot to talk about in an hour. I do want to talk about how you all see where this is going. It seemed like we lived through the crack epidemic back in the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, and eventually that was no longer the drug of choice. What about the heroin epidemic? What do you think? And I know that's a big silver, magic ball question, but where do you see this epidemic going? And I'll start off with Solicitor Richardson, since you're really on the front lines of dealing with law enforcement, dealing with the laws that you have to enforce, and the victims and the perpetrators.
I think I'm hopeful, and it's just because I've seen it in the past, but I think we will live to see a better day on heroin. I don't know how we get there, but I know that there's got to be social change first and foremost. We have, it's got to be not cool to do heroin anymore. And that sounds very Pollyannic, but Nancy Reagan, just say no? And that dropped the drug rates for generations. So we got to get rid of the supply, and we've talked a good bit about that. The supply is in mom and dad and grandparents' medicine cabinet. We got to get the cartels that are bringing the heroin in, because they're not bringing the pills in. There's enough of them. We shrink the pool on the pills, we shrink the pool on the heroin that's coming in, and we change the social conscious to where it's just not cool to do, and those people we'll move on to something else, hopefully not anything worse than heroin. But I think that it can be done. It's not going to be done overnight, but it didn't get here overnight either, Tim. It's, people are going to be addicted to something. I just think that there's a lot of stuff that would be easier to deal with than heroin or opioids.
Dr. Richardson, I know that the medical community has to be trying to figure out what they can do to make this better. On one hand, they need to prescribe these drugs to people who really need them, who are in serious pain. But on the other hand, it's these prescriptions that are getting into the hands of other people. What is the medical community doing to stem that?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to be more judicious in our prescribing. I mean, quite frankly, we need to be more conscious of that ourselves. We also need to be spending more time counseling patients through non-opioid pain control methods, using alternative methods away from that, so we're not just our knee-jerk reaction is to go to the opioid prescription, because that has contributed to a lot of this. So I think that is by far and away. The other thing that medical community in general is just some more investment in addiction medicine. I mean, that's its own specialty now, and I think that having more investment in that area, more focus, maybe more training in that area, I don't know if that's a big push right now in medical education, but I'm sure it probably is in many institutions. Is getting more training in how to deal with the addict once sort of the die is cast, so to speak. So to me, though, it all goes back, like I said, fundamentally to that physician-patient interaction, trying to avoid it from the get-go. So you're not, like the solicitor was talking about, you're not having that extra supply sitting around. We're stemming some of that.
Representative Clemens, anything from a legislative standpoint that you think the state could do to help stem the tide of it and help the people who are hooked?
Well, I don't think we can legislate the societal change, but we certainly will continue to stand up for law enforcement. Law enforcement plays a large role in this, and supporting law enforcement so that legislation fits the needs for the time. The government can't fix it all. I agree with Solicitor Richardson. It's going to take a societal change. That's all of us working together to change the way we do business with regard to the prescription drugs in our medicine cabinet, and to change the mindset. It has become socially acceptable in our schools for you to be taking illegal drugs. That's got to change.
Got to change. I want to go on to Major Mike Nunn. We just have less than 2 minutes left. You're sworn to serve and protect your community. What's your message to that community about heroin and opioids?
Tim, it's just a fact that a large portion of our property crime and some part of our violent crime is driven by illegal drugs, heroin being a significant part of that. Heroin addicts are desperate to get that next fix. They don't see anything beyond that next fix. That's the scope of their vision. We want to target the traffickers, but we also have to deal with the end users as well. They're creating a victim of their own, and we have to enforce those laws as well. So it's a tough job. We try to use our discretion as best we can. We're not unsympathetic to the plight of those who are addicted, but by the same token, when property crimes and violent crimes are committed, we have to deal with those regardless of who commits them.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you for all you do to try to stem the tide of this scourge on our society right now. Thank you for coming in to talk with us about it today. And don't forget, you can go to WPDE.com, look for our Hooked on Heroin section, and thank you for joining us and listening to what these gentlemen had to say about the heroin epidemic. Have a great day.